Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I stared at my computer screen, the cursor blinking in the empty reply field. The email from my friend Samantha had arrived just 20 minutes ago, and I'd already read it 4 times. Each reading made the words feel heavier, more real, more terrifying. It was supposed to be a simple invitation. Come to my family's cabin in Colorado for a week of hiking, fishing, and getting away from the city. I'd sent the same email to Samantha for 3 years running, and each time she'd politely declined with increasingly elaborate excuses. Work commitments, family obligations, prior plans that seemed to materialize out of thin air. I'd begun to think she simply didn't want to spend a week with me in the mountains. But this email was different. This email contained a confession that made my hands shake as I scrolled through the text. Samantha wasn't avoiding my cabin because she didn't want to come. She was avoiding it because of something that happened 4 years ago at her own family's mountain retreat. Something that had left her unable to sleep properly, unable to be alone in the woods, unable to even look at photographs of dense forest without her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The story she told was impossible. It had to be. People don't just disappear into some kind of living darkness. Cabins don't transform overnight into hollow shells of themselves. 8 strangers don't find themselves trapped together in a place that defies the basic laws of physics and human understanding. Yet, as I read her account, filled with details too specific and too strange to be fabricated, I found myself believing every word. Samantha had always been the most practical person I knew. In college, while the rest of us were experimenting with various theories about life and reality, she was studying accounting and planning her career path with military precision. She didn't believe in ghost stories or urban legends. She certainly didn't make them up, which meant that everything she'd written in this email had actually happened to her. The thought made my stomach turn. I pushed back from my desk and walked to the kitchen, needing distance from the words on the screen, but I could still see them in my mind. The description of the man with the too long face and jerky movements, the bitter tea that she'd been forced to drink, the hours of unconsciousness followed by an awakening into a nightmare that seemed to have no rules and no escape. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly, trying to process what I'd just read. Samantha had been through something traumatic, something that had clearly left her with lasting psychological damage. The question was, what had really happened to her in that cabin? Was there some kind of rational explanation for the events she described, or was I dealing with something far more sinister? According to Samantha's account, it had all started innocently enough. She was 24 then, visiting her parents at their mountain cabin during one of their rare family vacations. Her father had finally managed to take time off from his demanding job as a surgeon, and they'd planned a week of relaxation in the Colorado wilderness. Samantha had been looking forward to it, despite her chronic insomnia that had been plaguing her since her divorce 6 months earlier. The cabin was located about 15 miles outside of a small mountain town called Pine Ridge, accessible only by a winding dirt road that snaked through dense forest for the final 3 miles. Cell phone coverage was spotty at best, and there were no landlines in most of the vacation cabins scattered throughout the area. It was exactly the kind of place people went to disconnect from the world, to find peace in the silence of nature. But for Samantha, the silence had become oppressive. On the 3rd night of their stay, she'd lain in bed for hours, listening to her parents' gentle snoring from the next room and feeling the walls of the cabin closing in around her. The insomnia that had become her constant companion since the divorce was particularly bad that night, made worse by the complete absence of the city sounds she'd grown accustomed to. No traffic, no sirens, no late-night conversations drifting up from the street below. Just an endless, crushing quiet that seemed to press against her eardrums. Finally, around 2 in the morning, she'd given up on sleep entirely. She'd dressed quietly in hiking boots and a heavy jacket, left a note for her parents explaining that she'd gone for a walk and would be back before sunrise, and slipped out into the night. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and her breath formed clouds in the moonlit air as she made her way to the trail system that began just behind the cabin. She knew the main trails well from previous visits, but in her agitated state, she'd taken a wrong turn somewhere in the darkness. What should have been a familiar loop back to the cabin became an increasingly steep and rocky path that seemed to wind deeper into the mountains rather than circling back toward civilization. She'd walked for what felt like hours, the beam of her small flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead of her feet, before finally admitting to herself that she was completely lost. The realization had brought with it the first real stab of fear. She was alone in thousands of acres of wilderness, with no way to call for help and no clear idea of which direction would lead her back to safety. The night air was getting colder, and she could feel her body heat leaching away through her jacket. Hypothermia was a real possibility if she couldn't find shelter soon. That's when she'd seen the light through the trees. Not the harsh white glare of a security light, but a warm yellow glow that spoke of human habitation and warmth. She'd pushed through the underbrush toward it, branches catching at her jacket and scratching her face, driven by a desperate need to reach that beacon of hope in the darkness. The cabin that Samantha found in the small clearing was unlike any of the other mountain retreats she'd seen in the area. Where most were simple log structures designed for basic comfort, this one was clearly the product of serious money and careful planning. The exterior was finished in rich oak planking that gleamed in the porch light, and through the large windows she could see expensive furniture and what appeared to be state-of-the-art electronics. More importantly, the front door was standing wide open, spilling warm light out onto the small wooden porch. It was an invitation she couldn't resist in her cold and frightened state. Surely whoever lived here would understand her situation and be willing to help a lost hiker find her way back to civilization. At the very least, they might let her warm up for a few minutes before pointing her in the right direction. She'd called out a greeting as she approached the porch, not wanting to startle anyone who might be inside. When no one answered, she'd called again, louder this time. Still nothing. But the lights were on, and she thought she could hear the faint sound of a television or radio playing somewhere in the depths of the house. Someone was definitely home. They just hadn't heard her over whatever they were watching. The interior of the cabin was even more impressive than the exterior had suggested. The living room featured a massive stone fireplace with a gas insert, surrounded by leather furniture that looked like it had come straight from an expensive showroom. The kitchen was equipped with commercial-grade appliances and granite countertops that probably cost more than most people made in a year. A huge flat-screen television dominated one wall, currently displaying what appeared to be a nature documentary with the sound turned low. Samantha had settled onto the leather couch to wait, grateful for the warmth and the chance to rest her aching feet. The hiking boots she'd chosen were more suited to short walks than extended treks through rough terrain, and she could feel blisters forming on her heels. She'd been sitting there for perhaps 5 minutes when she heard footsteps approaching from what she assumed was a bedroom or bathroom somewhere else in the house. The man who appeared in the living room doorway was probably in his early 30s, dressed casually in jeans and a blue hoodie. At first glance, he seemed normal enough. Average height, brown hair, the kind of unremarkable appearance that would make him invisible in a crowd. But there was something about him that immediately set Samantha's nerves on edge, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was the way he moved, she realized as she watched him cross the room. His gait was slightly off, as if he wasn't quite comfortable in his own body. His arms swung at odd angles, and his head seemed to bob with each step in a way that reminded her of a marionette being operated by an inexperienced puppeteer. When he smiled at her, the expression didn't reach his eyes, and those eyes never quite met hers directly. "You look cold," he said. his voice pleasant enough but somehow flat, as if he were reading lines from a script. "Let me get you something warm to drink and a blanket." Samantha had started to explain her situation, how she'd gotten lost on the trails, how she just needed directions back to Pine Ridge, or at least to the main road. But he'd waved off her words with a dismissive gesture. "Plenty of time for that," he'd said, still not looking directly at her. "First, we need to get you warmed up. Can't have you catching pneumonia out there in the cold." He'd disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Samantha alone with her growing sense of unease. Everything about this situation felt wrong, but she couldn't identify exactly why. The man seemed friendly enough, even if his mannerisms were a bit odd. The cabin was clearly legitimate. You couldn't fake the kind of expensive fixtures and furniture she saw around her. And she was genuinely lost and in need of help. But something primitive in her brain was screaming warnings at her. Some ancient survival instinct that had kept her ancestors alive through countless dangers. Every cell in her body was telling her to get up and walk out of that cabin immediately, to take her chances in the cold wilderness rather than stay another moment in this warm, comfortable prison. When the man returned from the kitchen, he was carrying a steaming mug and what appeared to be a detailed topographic map of the area. The gesture seemed thoughtful, exactly what she would have expected from someone genuinely trying to help a lost hiker. But his behavior remained unnervingly strange. He set the mug on the coffee table in front of her and spread the map out beside it. But instead of sitting down to help her locate her position, he simply stood there watching her with that unsettling, indirect gaze. "Drink up," he said, gesturing toward the mug. "It's a special herbal blend, very warming." The tea, when Samantha lifted it to her lips, had an odd color. Not quite brown, not quite green, but something in between that reminded her of stagnant pond water. The smell was even worse, a combination of bitterness and something else she couldn't identify. Something that made her stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. But the man was still standing there, still watching her with that false smile, and she felt an irrational pressure to drink it rather than offend him. The first sip was worse than she'd expected. The liquid was indeed warm, but the taste was so bitter it made her eyes water. There was an underlying flavor beneath the bitterness, something sweet and cloying that reminded her of overripe fruit on the verge of rot. She forced herself to swallow, then set the mug back down on the table. "It's very distinctive," she managed, trying to be polite while fighting back the urge to gag. The man's smile widened, but it still looked like a mask rather than a genuine expression of pleasure. "My grandmother's recipe," he said. "She always said it could cure whatever ailed you." He finally moved away from her then, walking toward what appeared to be a hallway leading to the back of the cabin. "I'll just get you that blanket," he called over his shoulder. "Make yourself comfortable." But instead of disappearing down the hallway as she'd expected, he stopped just at the edge of the living room and turned back to watch her. The pressure of his gaze felt almost physical, and Samantha found herself reaching for the mug again despite her revulsion. She took another sip, then another, driven by some combination of politeness and an inexplicable compulsion she couldn't understand. With each swallow, the taste seemed to change slightly, becoming more palatable even as her vision began to blur around the edges. The expensive living room started to take on a dreamlike quality, the colors becoming more vivid, while the shapes became less distinct. She tried to stand, thinking dimly that she needed to leave immediately, but her legs felt like they were made of water. The last thing she remembered clearly was the sound of the mug hitting the hardwood floor as it slipped from her nerveless fingers. The man was moving toward her, but his approach seemed to take forever, as if he were walking through thick liquid. His face was changing as he came closer, the features becoming more pronounced, more angular, until it looked less like a human face and more like something carved from wood by an artist who had only heard descriptions of what people were supposed to look like. Then everything went black, and she tumbled into a darkness deeper than any sleep she'd ever experienced. When consciousness returned, it came slowly, and accompanied by a disorientation so complete that for several minutes, Samantha couldn't remember who she was, let alone where she was. The darkness around her was absolute, more complete than anything she'd ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was as if light had never existed, as if she'd awakened in a void where the very concept of illumination was foreign. Gradually, her other senses began to function again. She was lying on something soft, a couch or bed, and she could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and something else, something organic and unpleasant that reminded her of decomposing leaves. There were sounds around her, quiet breathing, the soft rustle of fabric, and occasionally a muffled sob or whisper. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she began to make out shapes around her. The room she was in appeared to be the same living room where she'd lost consciousness, but something was fundamentally different about it. The expensive furniture was still there, but it seemed faded somehow, as if she were looking at it through a dark filter. The large windows that had been so prominent before were now just rectangles of slightly lighter darkness, offering no view of the outside world. More disturbing was the realization that she was not alone. As her vision improved, she could make out the forms of other people scattered around the room, some sitting on furniture, others huddled on the floor. When she tried to count them, she got different numbers each time, as if the shadows were playing tricks on her perception. But she was certain there were at least 7 or 8 other people in the room with her, all of them as confused and frightened as she was. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice sounding strange and hollow in the unnatural quiet. A young girl's voice answered from somewhere to her left. "You're awake. We were starting to worry about you." The voice belonged to someone very young, maybe 11 or 12 years old, and it carried a tremor of fear that made Samantha's heart race. "Where are we?" Samantha asked, struggling to sit up. Her body felt heavy and unresponsive, as if she were moving underwater. "Same place you were before," said another voice, this one belonging to an adult woman. "But it's different now. Everything's different." As the others began to speak, Samantha learned that they all had similar stories. Each had found the cabin under different circumstances, some lost like her, others seeking help for various emergencies, but all had been offered the bitter tea by the strange man with the jerky movements and unnatural gait. All had lost consciousness after drinking it, and all had awakened here in this transformed version of the same room. But it was more than just transformed. As Samantha explored the space with increasingly desperate movements, she discovered that the cabin had become something impossible. The doors that had led to other rooms were simply gone, not locked or blocked, but absent entirely, as if they had never existed. The walls were solid where doorways should have been, the wood grain flowing uninterrupted across spaces that had definitely contained openings just hours before. The kitchen was still accessible, but when she investigated it, she found all the drawers and cabinets completely empty. Not just empty of food or dishes, but empty of everything. No utensils, no cleaning supplies, no signs that the kitchen had ever been used for its intended purpose. Even more disturbing, when she tried the faucet, nothing came out. No water, no sound of pipes. Nothing at all. The temperature in the room was neither warm nor cold, but somehow wrong in a way that made her skin crawl. It was as if the very air around them had been replaced with something that only resembled air, something that kept them alive, but felt alien in their lungs. When she breathed deeply, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was inhaling something that was fundamentally different from the atmosphere she'd known all her life. The first disappearance happened while they were still trying to understand their situation. One of the men, a middle-aged guy in hiking gear who said his name was Gary, had been growing increasingly agitated as the hours passed. He kept walking to the front door and pressing his ear against it, as if listening for something on the other side. When the others asked what he was doing, he'd just shaken his head and muttered about needing to check something. It was around what Samantha estimated to be their fourth or fifth hour in the transformed cabin when Gary finally opened that door. The sight that greeted them was unlike anything from the natural world. Instead of the forest clearing that should have been outside, there was only darkness, but not the normal darkness of night. This was something alive and moving, a substance that seemed to have weight and purpose. The dark mass pressed against the doorframe like a liquid, but it moved with deliberate intent rather than flowing according to gravity. It pulsed and shifted, occasionally revealing glimpses of something that might have been light deep within its depths. Not illumination exactly, but brief flashes of color that had no names in any human language Samantha knew. Gary stood transfixed in the doorway, staring into that impossible darkness with an expression of wonder and terror. When the others called to him, begging him to close the door and step back, he didn't seem to hear them. He was leaning forward slightly, as if the darkness were pulling at him with invisible hands. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's singing to me." Samantha couldn't hear any singing, but she could feel something emanating from the dark mass, a kind of psychic pressure that made her think of deep ocean trenches and the spaces between stars. It was calling to something primitive in her brain, something that wanted to step forward and let the darkness embrace her. Before any of them could stop him, Gary took a step forward into the darkness. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the mass surged upward and around him like a living thing. For just an instant, Samantha saw his face through the translucent darkness, his expression shifting from wonder to absolute terror as he realized what was happening to him. Then he was gone. Not just absorbed, but somehow erased, as if he had never existed at all. The darkness settled back to its previous level, pressing gently against the doorframe but making no attempt to enter the cabin. It was content to wait, patient as a spider in its web. The young girl, her name was Lily, Samantha learned, began to scream when Gary vanished. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of human terror, a primal shriek that spoke of every nightmare that had ever haunted a child's sleep. The others tried to comfort her, but there was no comfort to be given. They had all seen something that defied every law of physics and reason they understood. More disturbing than Gary's disappearance was the way the rest of them reacted to it. Within an hour, they had all begun to stare at the darkness with the same expression of longing that had preceded Gary's destruction. They couldn't help themselves. The thing outside the door was calling to them in ways that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to something deep in their subconscious minds. Samantha found herself walking to the windows and pressing her hands against the glass, trying to get closer to the darkness that pressed against the other side. The glass was burning hot, so hot that it should have blistered her skin instantly, but somehow it didn't hurt. She could feel the heat, could understand intellectually that it was dangerous, but the sensation felt distant and unimportant compared to the hypnotic pull of the darkness beyond. Time became meaningless in the transformed cabin. Samantha tried to keep track of the hours by counting her heartbeats, but even that became unreliable as her pulse seemed to slow and quicken according to no pattern she could understand. None of them felt hunger or thirst, despite what must have been days passing. They didn't need to use the bathroom, didn't feel the normal physiological needs that should have driven them to desperation in such circumstances. It was as if their bodies had been placed in some kind of suspended animation, maintained at a basic level of function but no longer truly alive in any meaningful sense. They were becoming something else, something that could exist in this impossible space between reality and nightmare. The psychological effects were even more disturbing than the physical ones. One by one, the other people in the cabin began to lose coherent thought. They would sit for hours staring at nothing, their eyes unfocused and their faces slack. When spoken to, they would respond with nonsensical phrases or simply repeat the last thing they had heard. The woman who had first spoken to Samantha when she woke up, she called herself Maria, was the second to succumb to the darkness outside. She had been sitting by the window for what felt like an entire day, pressing her face against the burning glass and whispering to something she claimed she could see moving within the dark mass. "It knows my name," she said when Samantha tried to pull her away from the window. "It's been waiting for me all my life. I have to go to it." Before anyone could stop her, Maria had walked calmly to the door and opened it. The darkness embraced her with what almost looked like tenderness, wrapping around her slowly and gently. She smiled as it consumed her, her face showing relief rather than terror. When she was gone, the others barely reacted. They were already too far gone to register the loss of another human being. Samantha tried desperately to maintain her sanity and her sense of self. She repeated her own name over and over again, clinging to the sound of it like a lifeline. She recited her address, her phone number, the names of her family members, anything that connected her to the world outside this nightmare. But even these anchors felt increasingly fragile as the hours passed. The young girl, Lily, seemed to be resisting the psychological dissolution better than the adults, but she was paying a terrible price for her clarity. She cried constantly, not the normal tears of a frightened child, but something that looked more like blood mixed with water. Her small body shook with tremors that never stopped, and she flinched away from any attempt at comfort. "I want my mommy," she whispered repeatedly, the words becoming a kind of mantra that seemed to be the only thing keeping her grounded in reality. Samantha tried to comfort her, but she was fighting her own battle against the strange lethargy that was settling over her mind like a heavy blanket. Every thought required enormous effort, and she found herself forgetting things constantly. What she had been doing moments before, what she had been trying to say, sometimes even where she was. The darkness outside seemed to be learning from each person it consumed. After Maria's disappearance, it began to pulse with a different rhythm, and Samantha could swear she could hear voices within it. Gary's voice and Maria's voice, calling out to the remaining survivors, begging them to join them in the beautiful darkness where there was no pain and no fear. By the time only 3 of them remained, Samantha, Lily, and a quiet woman who had never told them her name, the cabin itself had begun to change in more dramatic ways. The furniture was becoming transparent, as if it were slowly fading out of existence. The walls grew thin enough that they could see the darkness pressing against them from all sides, not just through the windows and the door. Samantha realized with growing horror that the cabin wasn't a refuge from the darkness. It was bait, a trap designed to hold them while the darkness slowly digested their reality around them. Eventually, there would be nothing left but the darkness itself, and they would have no choice but to become part of it. She tried to explain this to the others, but the unnamed woman just stared at her with vacant eyes and smiled. "It doesn't matter," she said in a dreamy voice. "Nothing matters anymore. We're already dead. We just don't know it yet." That was when Samantha understood that she was truly alone. Lily was still conscious, still fighting, but she was just a child with no understanding of what was happening to them. The responsibility for their survival fell entirely on Samantha's shoulders, and she had no idea how to carry it. In desperation, she began to search the increasingly insubstantial cabin for anything that might help them escape. The kitchen drawers had been empty before, but now they were beginning to merge with the countertops, becoming part of a seamless whole that defied the basic concepts of separate objects. The television had vanished entirely, and the expensive furniture was becoming ghostly outlines of itself. It was while she was searching behind the couch that she made a discovery that filled her with both hope and terror. There were deep gouges in the floor, as if something extremely heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly. The marks led from behind the couch to the front door, and they were fresh, made recently, possibly within the last few hours. As she traced the gouges with her fingers, she realized what they meant. The unnamed woman had been trying to drag her toward the door while she slept. Not just her, but Lily as well. And probably the couch they were sitting on. She had been planning to deliver them all to the darkness in one final offering. The woman was standing by the door now, her hand on the knob, smiling that vacant smile. "It's time," she said gently. "Time to go home." Samantha didn't think. She threw herself across the room and tackled the woman just as she began to turn the door handle. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, but the woman was surprisingly strong for someone who appeared to be in a trance. She fought back with desperate fury, scratching at Samantha's face and trying to bite her hands. "You don't understand," she hissed, her vacant expression replaced by something wild and desperate. "We have to go. It's calling us. We can't stay here anymore." The struggle seemed to last forever, but eventually Samantha managed to pin the woman down long enough to grab Lily and pull her away from the door. But even as she did, she could feel the pull of the darkness herself. It was stronger now, more insistent, and she could hear the voices of all the people who had been consumed calling out to her in harmony. The unnamed woman broke free and stumbled toward the door, fumbling with the handle. This time, Samantha didn't try to stop her. She was too busy fighting her own desire to follow, her own need to step into that beautiful darkness and let it wash away all her pain and fear and confusion. The woman opened the door and walked into the darkness with a sigh of relief. The mass embraced her eagerly, and for a moment Samantha could see all of their faces within it. Gary and Maria and the woman whose name she'd never learned. All of them peaceful and smiling and beckoning for her to join them. But she didn't join them. Instead, she grabbed Lily and ran toward the back of the cabin, hoping against hope that there might be another way out. The walls were almost completely transparent now, and she could see the darkness pressing in from all sides. But there was still a small area near what had once been a bathroom that seemed more solid than the rest. She threw her shoulder against the wall there and felt it give way like wet cardboard. Beyond it was another kind of darkness. Not the living, hungry darkness that had consumed the others, but the normal darkness of a forest at night. She could see stars through the canopy of trees, and she could smell pine and earth, and all the normal scents of the natural world. Without hesitation, she pushed Lily through the opening and followed her into the blessed reality of the ordinary forest. Behind them, the cabin was collapsing in on itself, the walls folding inward like a house of cards until there was nothing left but a small clearing where nothing grew. They ran through the forest until they found a trail, and followed the trail until they reached the main road. A passing motorist picked them up and drove them to the police station where Samantha tried to explain what had happened. The officers were kind but skeptical, and when they investigated the area she described, they found no trace of any cabin or clearing. Lily was returned to her family, who had been searching for her for 3 days. She never spoke about what had happened in the cabin, and within a few weeks she seemed to have forgotten it entirely. Children, Samantha learned, are remarkably resilient in the face of trauma that would destroy an adult's sanity. But Samantha never forgot. She couldn't forget. The memory of that place and what it had done to the people trapped there haunted her every dream and followed her through every waking hour. She moved to a different state, changed her phone number, and tried to rebuild her life. But she could never escape the knowledge that somewhere in the Colorado mountains, there was a darkness that was still waiting, still hungry, still calling out to anyone who might be foolish enough to listen. That's why she couldn't come to my cabin. That's why she would never again venture into the deep woods where the darkness might be lurking, patient as a spider in its web, ready to welcome the next lost soul into its eternal embrace. This happened 2 years ago, during the summer before my senior year of high school. I was 17 then, living in the Catskill region of New York with my family. The area was perfect for someone like me who craved outdoor adventures, endless mountain ranges, winding hiking paths, and nature preserves that seemed to stretch on forever. Our suburban neighborhood sat right on the edge of wilderness, making it easy to disappear into the woods whenever I needed to escape. My friend Dylan was the lucky one among our group. His family had just moved into this incredible house that backed directly into the Catskill Nature Preserve. The property was something out of a magazine, a sprawling stone patio with an in-ground pool and hot tub, surrounded by perfectly manicured landscaping. But what made it truly special was what lay beyond the back fence, a professional fire pit area that connected to a well-maintained trail system leading deep into the mountains. Dylan's parents had struck gold with this purchase, and we all knew it. The house became our unofficial headquarters that summer, the launching point for countless adventures into the wilderness that stretched endlessly behind his backyard. Our friend group consisted of 4 core members: myself, Dylan, Trevor, and our newest addition, Camden. Camden had moved to the area just 3 months earlier, and while he'd integrated well into our group, he hadn't yet experienced what we considered our ultimate test of courage, a nighttime hike up the mountain trail. The trail itself was deceptively simple during daylight hours. After 5 minutes of walking through dense forest, you'd emerge into a breathtaking meadow filled with waist-high grass that swayed hypnotically in the breeze. The elevated field offered stunning views of the surrounding valley, with golden sunlight filtering through the trees and creating an almost magical atmosphere. Beyond the meadow, the trail continued to an abandoned railroad track that cut straight through the mountain. Crossing those tracks opened up access to the steeper, more challenging mountain path that led to our favorite lookout point. During the day, this hike was pure joy. At night, it transformed into something entirely different. The same peaceful meadow became an exposed danger zone where anything could be watching from the tree line. The railroad tracks, so picturesque in sunlight, turned into an eerie corridor that seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions, disappearing into absolute darkness. The mountain trail itself became a gauntlet of shadows and strange sounds, where every snapping twig could signal potential danger. We'd done night hikes before, but always as a complete group. Camden had only experienced the trail during daylight hours, hiking with us on lazy afternoon adventures when the biggest concern was sunburn. Now, as the summer progressed, we decided it was time for his initiation. The plan was simple. He would lead us up the mountain path at night, proving he had the courage and outdoor skills to be a true member of our tight-knit group. The afternoon leading up to that fateful night had been perfect. We'd spent hours at Dylan's pool, enjoying the freedom that came with his parents being away for the weekend. A group of girls from school had joined us for most of the day, but as evening approached, we'd made it clear this would be a guys-only adventure. By 10 o'clock, we were alone, sitting around the fire pit as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The anticipation was building. Camden seemed nervous but excited, constantly asking questions about the trail difficulty and what to expect. Dylan assured him it would be fine, explaining how we'd done this hike dozens of times and knew every rock, route, and turn by heart. Trevor joked that the hardest part would be not laughing when Camden inevitably jumped at every shadow and sound. But as we gathered our supplies and prepared for the hike, I felt something I couldn't quite identify. The air seemed heavier than usual, and the familiar sounds of the forest had taken on an ominous quality. The crickets seemed louder, more aggressive. The wind through the trees carried an unusual chill despite the warm summer evening. Even the fire seemed to burn differently, casting shadows that moved in ways that made me uncomfortable. Looking back now, I wonder if some part of me sensed what was coming. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just teenage paranoia. But something felt wrong about that night from the very beginning. Unfortunately, excitement and peer pressure overrode any caution I might have felt. We were 17-year-old boys convinced of our own invincibility, about to venture into darkness with no understanding of what waited for us in those woods. By 11 o'clock, we had gathered everything we thought we'd need: heavy-duty flashlights with extra batteries, pocket knives, backpacks with water and snacks, and Dylan's father's emergency whistle in case we got separated. The gear felt reassuring in the bright lights of the house, but as we stepped through the back gate and onto the trail, everything took on a different weight. The familiar became foreign, and the comfortable became threatening. The initial section of the trail was narrow, forcing us to walk single file with Camden in the lead. The beam of his flashlight created a cone of visibility that extended maybe 15 feet ahead, beyond which everything disappeared into absolute blackness. The trees seemed to press in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the moonlight couldn't penetrate it. Every step we took seemed amplified in the silence, our footfalls echoing off the trees and creating a rhythm that sounded almost like pursuit. Camden was trying to project confidence, but I could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he kept sweeping his flashlight back and forth nervously. Behind him, Dylan offered encouragement and direction, pointing out familiar landmarks that were now barely visible in the darkness. Trevor brought up the rear, occasionally making jokes to lighten the mood, but even his usual humor seemed forced. The forest at night was alive in ways that daylight never revealed. Strange rustling sounds came from the underbrush on both sides of the trail, accompanied by distant calls from nocturnal animals we couldn't identify. Branches creaked overhead without any wind to move them. Leaves scattered across the path as if disturbed by invisible feet. The temperature seemed to drop with each step we took deeper into the woods, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter despite the summer warmth we'd left behind at the house. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, we reached the edge of the meadow. During the day, this transition was always dramatic and beautiful, stepping from forest shade into brilliant sunlight and expansive views. At night, it was terrifying. The meadow stretched out before us like a vast black ocean, with the tall grass creating waves of movement that could hide anything. The openness that felt so freeing during daylight now felt dangerously exposed. The moon was visible but partially obscured by clouds, providing just enough light to create confusing shadows and shapes throughout the field. The grass moved constantly, responding to wind currents we couldn't feel, creating the illusion of things moving through it. Every few seconds, a particularly strong gust would cause an entire section to bend and sway, looking exactly like something large pushing through it toward us. Camden stopped at the meadow's edge, his flashlight beam barely penetrating the darkness ahead. "How do we know where to go?" he asked, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Dylan pointed toward the far side of the field, where the continuation of the trail was marked by a gap in the trees. It looked impossibly distant, and the path across the meadow was little more than a slightly worn track through the grass. We began crossing the field in a tight group, no longer maintaining the single-file formation. The exposed feeling was overwhelming. We were visible from any direction, with nowhere to hide if something went wrong. The grass on either side of the narrow path was tall enough to conceal a person, and it moved constantly, creating false alarms every few steps. My imagination began conjuring threats behind every shadow, and I found myself turning frequently to check our surroundings. Halfway across the meadow, we heard our first unexplained sound. It was a low, guttural noise that seemed to come from somewhere in the grass to our right. We all stopped immediately. Flashlights pointed toward the sound, but the beams revealed nothing except swaying vegetation. The noise lasted maybe 3 seconds, then stopped abruptly. We stood frozen, straining to hear any follow-up, but the meadow had returned to its normal symphony of wind and rustling grass. "Probably just a deer," Dylan whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. We resumed walking, but the pace had quickened noticeably. The remaining distance to the far tree line seemed to take forever, with each step feeling more urgent than the last. By the time we reached the continuation of the trail, we were all breathing heavily and constantly looking over our shoulders. The forest on the far side of the meadow felt different from what we'd left behind. The trees were older and larger, creating an even denser canopy that blocked out what little moonlight had been available in the field. The trail here was less maintained, with more obstacles to navigate and less clear direction. Camden continued to lead, but his progress had slowed considerably as he carefully picked his way around fallen logs and protruding roots. The section of trail leading to the railroad tracks was the most challenging part of the hike, even during daylight. The path wound steadily upward through increasingly dense forest, with several creek crossings and a notorious patch of thorn bushes that had to be navigated carefully. At night, these obstacles became genuine hazards that required constant attention and teamwork to overcome safely. The thorn bushes were particularly treacherous in the darkness. What looked like a simple detour during the day became a complex puzzle of finding openings between the thorny branches while maintaining our footing on uneven ground. We had to move through one at a time, with the person in front calling back warnings about particularly dangerous spots. My jacket got caught several times, and I could feel thorns scraping against my legs despite wearing thick jeans. Camden was struggling with the terrain, occasionally stumbling or getting momentarily disoriented when his flashlight beam didn't reveal enough detail to navigate safely. Dylan stayed close behind him, offering guidance and encouragement, but I could sense growing frustration in both of them. Trevor and I followed, trying to keep spirits up with occasional comments. But the oppressive atmosphere of the forest was making casual conversation increasingly difficult. The sounds around us had changed as we climbed higher. The familiar cricket chorus had faded, replaced by more mysterious noises. Occasional snapping branches, rustling that seemed too purposeful to be wind-driven, and distant calls that might have been owls but sounded somehow wrong. Our own noise seemed amplified in the forest, with every footstep, every whispered comment, every rustle of clothing echoing back from the trees in ways that made it sound like we were being followed. About 20 minutes into this section of the hike, we encountered the rocky hill that led up to the railroad tracks. During the day, this was a fun scramble over boulders and through crevices. At night, it became a dangerous climb that required complete focus and careful placement of every hand and foot. The rocks were damp from evening dew, making them slippery and unpredictable. Camden's flashlight could only illuminate one small section at a time, forcing us to climb largely by feel. I was third in the climbing order, following behind Dylan, when I heard Camden give a sharp intake of breath above us. "There's something up here," he said, his voice tight with tension. Dylan immediately climbed faster to reach him, and I could hear urgent whispered conversation above me. Trevor, still at the bottom of the rock face, called up asking what was happening. "Just some weird marks in the dirt," Dylan called back down, but his tone suggested he was more concerned than he was letting on. When I reached the top of the rocks and emerged onto the railroad right-of-way, I saw what had caught Camden's attention. The gravel between the rails was disturbed in a pattern that looked almost like footprints, but they were wrong somehow. Too long, with spacing that didn't match normal human stride patterns. The railroad tracks themselves stretched away in both directions, disappearing into complete darkness beyond the range of our flashlights. During daylight hours, you could see for miles in both directions, with the tracks following the natural contours of the mountain ridge. At night, they created a corridor of absolute blackness that seemed to swallow our light beams. The silence here was different too, heavier and more complete, as if the tracks absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. We gathered on the gravel bed between the rails, ostensibly to rest before tackling the final ascent to the lookout point, but really because none of us wanted to admit how unsettled we were becoming. The railroad had always been one of our favorite parts of the hike, a dramatic transition point where civilization's remnants met pure wilderness. Tonight, it felt ominous and unwelcoming. Camden kept his flashlight beam trained on the disturbed gravel, clearly bothered by what he'd found. "Those don't look like normal footprints," he said, stating what we were all thinking. Dylan knelt down to examine them more closely, but the shifting gravel made it impossible to determine exactly what had created the marks. They could have been animal tracks, or the result of maintenance workers, or just natural settling of the railroad bed. but they could also have been something else entirely. Trevor suggested we continue to the lookout point and worry about the tracks on our way back down. It was a reasonable proposal, and staying on schedule would get us back to the safety of Dylan's house sooner. But as we prepared to cross the tracks and enter the final section of trail, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with fear. The disturbed gravel wasn't just random scuffing. There was a clear pattern leading from where we stood toward the mountain trail entrance. Whatever had made those marks had been heading in the same direction we were planning to go, and the tracks looked recent. The final section of trail to the lookout point was typically our favorite part of the entire hike. The path was well maintained and clearly marked, winding through beautiful forest with several scenic overlooks along the way. The climb was challenging, but not difficult, and the anticipation of reaching our destination usually made the time pass quickly. Tonight, everything felt different. The moment we crossed the railroad tracks and entered the mountain trail proper, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The forest here felt older and wilder, with massive trees that must have been growing for centuries. Their trunks were so large that our flashlight beams couldn't illuminate their full circumference, creating the impression that we were walking through a grove of living pillars that disappeared into the darkness above our heads. Camden had settled into a steady rhythm leading our group, but I could see the strain was beginning to show. His flashlight beam wavered more frequently, and he was breathing harder than the moderate climb warranted. Dylan continued offering encouragement and navigation tips, but his own nervousness was becoming apparent in the way he kept checking over his shoulder and sweeping his light from side to side. The trail here followed a series of switchbacks that took us steadily higher up the mountain face. Each turn revealed a new section of forest, but also eliminated our view of where we'd just been. The effect was disorienting, making it impossible to maintain a sense of direction or distance traveled. What should have been a familiar route became a maze of similar-looking trees and shadows. About 15 minutes into the climb, we began hearing sounds that couldn't be easily explained. They started as occasional snapping branches somewhere in the forest around us, but the sounds seemed to follow our progress up the mountain. Whenever we stopped to listen, the noises stopped too. When we resumed hiking, they resumed as well, maintaining a consistent distance that suggested they were pacing us, rather than coinciding with our movement by chance. Trevor was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "Is something following us?" he whispered during one of our listening stops. The question hung in the air, unanswered, because none of us wanted to confirm what we were all suspecting. Dylan suggested it was probably just echo effects from our own footsteps, but even he didn't sound convinced by his explanation. The sounds grew more distinct as we climbed higher. What had started as random branch snapping evolved into a rhythm that definitely suggested bipedal movement. There would be two distinct sounds in succession, like footsteps, followed by a pause, then two more sounds. The timing matched human walking pace, but the sounds themselves were wrong. They were too heavy, as if whatever was making them weighed much more than a normal person, or was deliberately stepping harder than necessary. Camden's pace had increased noticeably, and he was no longer stopping to carefully examine obstacles before navigating them. His urgency was infectious, and soon we were all moving faster than was safe on the uneven trail. Several times one of us stumbled or nearly tripped, but we kept pushing upward, driven by a growing sense that we needed to reach the lookout point as quickly as possible. The temperature seemed to drop with each step we climbed, despite the physical exertion that should have warmed us up. The air felt thinner too, though we weren't at high enough elevation for that to make sense. Most disturbing of all, the familiar scents of the forest, pine, earth, decaying leaves, were being overwhelmed by something else. It was a musty, organic smell that reminded me of wet animal fur, but stronger and more unpleasant. When we were perhaps 10 minutes from the lookout point, Camden suddenly stopped so abruptly that Dylan nearly collided with him. "Did you guys hear that?" Camden whispered, his voice barely audible. We all strained to listen, and after a few seconds we heard what had caught his attention. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard in the forest, a low, rhythmic noise that seemed to come from somewhere ahead of us on the trail. It wasn't quite growling and wasn't quite breathing, but it had elements of both. The sound came in regular intervals, lasting about 3 seconds each time, with 5-second pauses between repetitions. We stood frozen on the trail, listening to this mysterious sound and trying to determine its source and distance. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the lookout point, which meant whatever was making it was positioned between us and our destination. The logical response would have been to turn around and head back down the mountain, but teenage pride and curiosity overrode common sense. Dylan suggested we continue but move more carefully, staying alert for any signs of danger. Camden agreed, though I could see his hands shaking as he gripped his flashlight. Trevor and I exchanged glances that communicated our shared nervousness, but neither of us wanted to be the one to suggest retreat. We resumed climbing, but now every step felt like a move in a dangerous game where we didn't know the rules or understand the stakes. The final approach to the lookout point had always been the most rewarding part of our hike. The trail made one last steep climb through a gap in the rock face, then opened onto a natural stone platform that offered spectacular views of the Hudson River Valley below. On clear nights, you could see lights from towns 20 miles away, creating a glittering tapestry that made the challenging hike worthwhile. Tonight, as we approached that familiar gap in the rocks, everything felt wrong. The mysterious sound we'd been hearing had stopped about 5 minutes earlier, leaving us in a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Camden's flashlight beam revealed the familiar rock formation ahead, but the shadows seemed deeper and more ominous than they should have been. We reached the base of the final climb and paused to catch our breath and steel our nerves. The rock face that led to the lookout point was maybe 15 feet high, with natural handholds and ledges that made it an easy scramble during daylight. At night, it became a treacherous climb where a single misstep could result in a serious fall. Camden went first, his flashlight clamped between his teeth to free both hands for climbing. The beam created wild, swinging shadows as he moved, making it difficult for the rest of us to follow his progress. Dylan went next, then me, with Trevor bringing up the rear. The climb took several minutes, with each of us calling out warnings about loose rocks or tricky handholds. When I finally pulled myself over the edge onto the lookout platform, I was surprised by what I saw. Camden and Dylan were standing at the far edge of the platform, but they weren't looking out at the valley view. Instead, they were staring at something on the stone surface near their feet. Their body language suggested confusion and concern. "What is it?" I asked as I approached them, with Trevor climbing up behind me. Dylan pointed his flashlight at the ground, revealing what had caught their attention. The stone platform was covered with marks that looked like they'd been scratched or scraped into the rock surface. The marks formed rough patterns that might have been random, but seemed too deliberate to be natural weathering. The scratches were deep enough to be clearly visible in our flashlight beams, and they covered an area roughly 10 feet square in the center of the platform. Some of the marks looked recent, with sharp edges that hadn't been worn smooth by weather. Others appeared older, creating layers of scratching that suggested whatever had made them had been returning to this spot repeatedly over time. Trevor joined us and immediately noticed something we'd missed. "Look at this," he said, directing his flashlight to the edge of the platform. There, clearly visible in the dirt that had accumulated in cracks between the stones, were the same unusual footprint patterns we'd seen at the railroad tracks. But these were clearer and more defined, showing what definitely looked like foot shapes but with proportions that weren't quite human. The prints were longer than normal human feet and narrower. But most disturbing was the spacing between them. The stride length suggested something with much longer legs than any of us possessed. The depth of the impressions indicated significant weight, but the narrow shape suggested something lean rather than bulky. We stood in a tight group in the center of the platform. Flashlights pointed downward at the evidence around us. The spectacular view that had drawn us here was forgotten, overshadowed by the growing realization that we weren't alone on this mountain. Something else used this lookout point, and based on the extensive markings, it had been coming here regularly. The wind had picked up since we'd reached the platform, creating a constant rustling in the trees below us and making it difficult to distinguish between natural sounds and potential threats. Every few seconds, a particularly strong gust would cause branches to scrape against each other, producing sounds that could easily be mistaken for movement or voices. Camden was the first to suggest we should leave. "I don't like this," he said, stating what we were all feeling. Whatever made these marks might come back. Dylan agreed, and we began preparing for the descent. But as we gathered near the edge where we'd climbed up, Trevor made an observation that stopped us cold. "The footprints," he said, pointing his flashlight toward the climbing route. "They continue down the rocks. Whatever made them went down the same way we came up." He traced the beam along the stone surface, revealing clear impressions in the dirt and moss that covered the rock face. The prints led from the platform down toward the trail we'd just climbed. The implications were terrifying. If these tracks were recent, and if whatever made them had descended the same route we'd used to reach the lookout, then it might still be somewhere on the trail below us. Our route back to safety could be blocked by whatever creature had been using this place as its territory. We spent several minutes discussing options, but there really was only one choice. We had to go back down the same trail we'd used to reach the lookout point. The alternative was spending the night on the exposed platform, which none of us were prepared for. As frightening as the descent might be, staying put seemed even more dangerous. Dylan took the lead for the climb back down to the trail, with Camden following behind him. I went third, and Trevor brought up the rear. The descent was nerve-wracking, with every handhold and footstep requiring careful testing before committing our weight. The knowledge that something else had recently made this same climb added an extra layer of anxiety to an already challenging task. When we finally reached the trail level and regrouped, we made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of heading directly back down the mountain the same way we'd come up, we decided to take the longer route that branched off from the main trail about halfway down. This alternate path would add 15 minutes to our descent, but it would also take us away from whatever might be waiting on the direct route. The trail fork that would prove so significant to our night was located about halfway down the mountain, at a point where the main path was joined by an older, less maintained route that eventually merged back with the primary trail near the bottom. During our daytime hikes, we'd explored both branches and knew they were equally safe, though the alternate route was longer and more challenging. Our original plan had been simple. Camden would take the longer path alone as a final test of his courage and navigation skills, while the rest of us took the direct route back to the railroad tracks. We'd meet up at the bottom, complete Camden's initiation with congratulations and backslapping, then head home to celebrate another successful adventure. The plan seemed reasonable when we'd discussed it at Dylan's house, but now, after everything we'd experienced, it felt recklessly dangerous. However, Camden insisted on going through with the original plan. "I didn't come this far to chicken out now," he said, trying to project confidence despite the obvious fear in his voice. "Besides, if something is following the main trail, the alternate route might actually be safer." His logic was sound, but the idea of splitting up our group felt wrong given what we'd encountered. Dylan tried to convince him to stick with us, pointing out that the initiation was just a symbolic gesture and that he'd already proven his courage by leading us to the lookout point under such difficult conditions. But Camden was adamant, and eventually we agreed to proceed with the original plan, though with significant modifications for safety. We synchronized our watches and established check-in procedures. Camden would signal us with his flashlight every 5 minutes, and we would respond with our own lights to confirm visual contact. If anyone failed to make contact at the designated times, the other group would immediately come looking. We also agreed on emergency signals and established a rendezvous point at the bottom of the trail. The split in the trail was marked by a large boulder that served as a natural landmark. The main path continued straight, following the most direct route down the mountain. The alternate route branched off to the right, winding through denser forest before eventually curving back to rejoin the main trail. During daylight, both paths were clearly visible and well marked. At night, the alternate route disappeared into darkness within a few feet of the split. Camden checked his gear one final time, making sure his flashlight batteries were fresh and his phone was easily accessible. We reviewed the timing once more, confirmed the check-in signals, and wished him luck. He seemed nervous but determined as he headed into the trees, his flashlight beam quickly disappearing among the thick vegetation. Dylan, Trevor, and I continued down the main trail, but our progress was much slower than usual. Every few minutes, we stopped to watch for Camden's signal light, scanning the trees to our right, where we knew his alternate route was running roughly parallel to our position. The first few check-ins went smoothly, with his light appearing right on schedule and our response signals acknowledging his safe progress. But as we descended further down the mountain, the terrain became more challenging and the distance between the two trails increased. By the fourth check-in, Camden's signal was barely visible through the dense forest, appearing as just a brief flicker of light that might have been imagination. We responded with our own signals, but we couldn't be sure he'd seen them. The main trail at this section was steep and rocky, requiring careful attention to foot placement and frequent use of trees and boulders for balance and support. Under normal circumstances, we would have been moving quickly and confidently, but tonight every shadow and sound demanded investigation. Our progress slowed to a cautious crawl that ate up precious time. When the fifth check-in time arrived, we stopped and waited, flashlights ready to respond to Camden's signal. 5 minutes passed, with no sign of his light. We waited another 5 minutes, then began signaling frantically in hopes that our lights might attract his attention if he was having trouble seeing us. Still no response. Dylan made the decision to leave the main trail and try to locate Camden's alternate route. The forest between the two paths was thick and challenging, with no established trail to follow. We had to push through dense undergrowth and navigate around fallen trees and rock formations, all while trying to maintain our sense of direction. After 15 minutes of difficult bushwhacking, we found what we thought was Camden's trail, but there was no sign of recent passage. The path was overgrown and appeared to have been unused for months. Either we'd found the wrong route, or Camden had gotten lost and wandered off the trail entirely. Trevor suggested that Camden might have reached the bottom ahead of schedule and was waiting for us at the rendezvous point. It was possible he'd moved quickly down the alternate route and simply hadn't seen our signals due to the terrain. This optimistic scenario seemed increasingly unlikely as time passed, but it was better than considering the alternatives. We made our way back to the main trail and resumed our descent, moving as quickly as safety allowed. The need to find Camden and confirm his safety had become our primary concern, overriding the caution that had been guiding our movements earlier in the night. But as we approached the bottom of the mountain and the junction with the railroad tracks, a new fear began to take hold. What if whatever we'd been sensing on the mountain had found Camden on his solitary route? What if his failure to make the check-in signals wasn't due to equipment problems or navigation errors, but because something had prevented him from continuing his descent? We reached the railroad tracks in record time, our concern for Camden overriding the caution that had been governing our movements throughout the night. The familiar gravel bed and steel rails looked exactly as they had during our ascent, but the atmosphere felt different, more charged with tension and possibility. We immediately began searching for signs of Camden's arrival, but found no evidence that he'd reached the rendezvous point. Dylan called Camden's name several times, but kept his voice low, unwilling to announce our presence too loudly to whatever might be listening in the darkness. The calls echoed off the surrounding trees and faded into silence with no response. We tried his cell phone, but the calls went straight to voicemail, suggesting his phone was either turned off or out of battery. Trevor suggested we wait at the tracks for another 15 minutes before taking further action. Camden might have encountered difficulties on the alternate trail that delayed his arrival, or he might have taken a wrong turn and needed extra time to find his way back to the correct route. 15 minutes would give him a reasonable window to appear, while not delaying our own safety unnecessarily. We positioned ourselves on a large boulder beside the tracks, where we'd have a clear view in all directions and could easily spot Camden's flashlight when he emerged from the forest. The waiting was agony. Every sound from the surrounding woods could have been Camden approaching, or it could have been something else entirely. The darkness seemed to pulse with potential threats and false hopes. Halfway through our wait, we heard movement in the forest on the opposite side of the tracks from where we expected Camden to emerge. It was definitely the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, breaking branches and disturbing leaves in a way that suggested significant size and weight. We turned our flashlights toward the sound, but the beams couldn't penetrate the dense vegetation far enough to reveal the source. The movement continued for several minutes, following a path parallel to the railroad tracks but staying within the cover of the trees. Whatever was making the sound was deliberately avoiding the open area around the tracks, suggesting either animal wariness or something more calculated. The sounds were rhythmic and purposeful, definitely not the random movement of a deer or other common forest animal. As we strained to track the movement through the trees, Dylan suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed toward the trail opening where we'd expected Camden to appear. A figure was emerging from the forest, but even in the poor light, it was clear that something was wrong. The silhouette was human-sized but moved in a way that seemed unnatural. Too fluid, with a gait that didn't match normal walking patterns. We trained our flashlights on the figure, but the distance and intervening vegetation made it impossible to make out clear details. What we could see was disturbing enough. The figure was tall and lean, with proportions that seemed slightly off, arms that hung too long, a posture that was too straight, movements that were too smooth and controlled. The figure paused at the edge of the cleared area around the tracks, as if sensing our presence or evaluating the situation. For several long moments, it remained motionless, creating a standoff where neither side moved or made sound. The silence was broken only by the continuing movement in the forest on the opposite side of the tracks, suggesting that whatever we were seeing was not alone. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped backward into the forest and disappeared. The movement was so fluid and quick that it seemed almost like a magic trick. One moment it was visible, the next it was gone without any sound of retreat or continued movement through the underbrush. We sat in stunned silence, trying to process what we'd just witnessed. The figure had been roughly where Camden should have emerged from the alternate trail, but it definitely hadn't been Camden. The size, movement, and behavior were all wrong. The implications were terrifying. If this thing had come from Camden's route, what had happened to our friend? Dylan made the decision that probably saved our lives. "We're leaving," he announced, standing up from the boulder. "Right now. Camden will have to find his own way back." It seemed like abandonment, but the alternative, investigating further or waiting longer, felt increasingly dangerous. We began moving quickly along the railroad tracks toward the trail that would take us back to Dylan's house. But before we'd gone more than 100 yards, we heard Camden's voice calling our names from somewhere in the forest behind us. The relief was overwhelming, but it was immediately tempered by confusion and new fear. Camden's voice was coming from the wrong direction, not from the trail where the figure had appeared, but from deeper in the forest on the far side of the tracks. How had he gotten there? And why did his voice sound strange, carrying an echo or distortion that made it seem unnatural? We stopped and called back to him, trying to guide him toward our location. But as we listened to his responses, something felt increasingly wrong. The voice was definitely Camden's, but the words were oddly phrased, and the responses didn't quite match our questions. It was as if someone was imitating Camden's voice, but didn't fully understand the context of our conversation. Trevor pointed out something that made our blood freeze. "Listen to the timing," he whispered. "His voice and the movement in the forest aren't matching up." He was right. We could still hear something moving through the trees, but the sounds weren't coming from the same location as the voice calling our names. The realization hit us simultaneously. Whatever was calling to us in Camden's voice wasn't Camden. It was something else. something that had learned to mimic human speech but couldn't perfectly replicate human behavior. The real Camden was still missing, and something that shouldn't exist was trying to lure us deeper into the forest. We ran. The sprint back to Dylan's house was the longest 20 minutes of my life. We abandoned all pretense of stealth or caution, crashing through the forest with our flashlights sweeping wildly ahead of us, focused solely on putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and whatever we'd encountered at the railroad tracks. Behind us, Camden's voice continued calling our names, but the calls grew more distorted and less human with each repetition. The trail back through the forest seemed longer than usual, with familiar landmarks appearing in unexpected locations or not appearing at all. Several times we took wrong turns that led to dead ends or unfamiliar sections of forest, forcing us to backtrack and waste precious time. The disorientation was so complete that I began to wonder if the trails themselves had somehow changed, rearranged by whatever forces controlled this part of the mountain. Dylan led our panicked retreat, using his superior knowledge of the area to navigate by instinct when the regular trail markers failed us. Trevor and I followed closely, occasionally stumbling over roots or rocks but maintaining our desperate pace. Our flashlight beams created a small bubble of visibility around us, but beyond that cone of light, the forest pressed in with malevolent presence. The sounds of pursuit were sporadic but unmistakable. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, and occasionally that voice that sounded like Camden but carried undertones that made it clear it was something else entirely. Whatever was following us was staying just out of sight, matching our pace but not attempting to close the distance. The psychological effect was more terrifying than direct confrontation would have been. When we finally reached the meadow that marked the halfway point of our return journey, we discovered that our ordeal was far from over. The open field that had felt so exposed during our outbound journey now felt like a trap. The tall grass provided cover for anything that might be stalking us, while leaving us visible to observation from the surrounding tree line. We paused at the edge of the meadow, breathing heavily and trying to gather courage for the crossing. The field looked different than it had earlier. The grass seemed taller and denser, moving in patterns that didn't match the wind direction. Dark patches throughout the field might have been shadows, or might have been something else entirely. Dylan suggested we circle around the meadow rather than crossing directly, but that would add significant time to our journey and force us through unfamiliar terrain. Trevor argued for the direct route, pointing out that speed was more important than stealth at this point. I found myself unable to make a decision, paralyzed by the knowledge that either choice could lead to disaster. The decision was made for us when we heard the sound that had haunted us earlier in the evening. That low, rhythmic noise that wasn't quite growling and wasn't quite breathing. It was coming from the forest behind us, much closer than before. Whatever had been following us was preparing to emerge from the trees, and we were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. We ran across the meadow in a straight line, abandoning any pretense of tactical movement. The tall grass whipped against our legs and tangled around our feet, making each step a struggle. Our flashlights created crazy patterns of light and shadow as we ran, occasionally illuminating shapes in the grass that might have been rocks or logs or something worse. Halfway across the field, Trevor tripped and went down hard, his flashlight flying from his hand and disappearing into the grass. Dylan and I immediately stopped to help him, but in those few seconds of vulnerability, we heard something that nearly destroyed our remaining composure. The mimicked voice of Camden was now coming from multiple directions, as if several sources were calling our names simultaneously. We found Trevor's flashlight and got him back on his feet, but he was limping badly from what was probably a sprained ankle. The final sprint to the forest edge took everything we had, with Dylan and I supporting Trevor between us, while constantly checking over our shoulders for signs of pursuit. When we finally reached the continuation of the trail on the far side of the meadow, we allowed ourselves one brief moment of hope. We were almost back to Dylan's house, almost to safety and lights and locked doors. But as we entered the final section of forest trail, we made a discovery that crushed that hope immediately. Dylan's cell phone was missing. He'd had it when we reached the railroad tracks. I remembered him checking it when we were trying to call Camden. But now it was gone, dropped somewhere during our panicked retreat. Without that phone, his parents would be unable to reach him when they returned from their weekend trip. The consequences of losing it would be severe, but the thought of returning to search for it was unthinkable. Yet Dylan was adamant. "I have to go back," he said, his voice showing the strain of the night's events. "I can't afford to lose that phone. My parents will kill me, and we'll all get in trouble." Trevor and I tried to talk him out of it, pointing out the obvious dangers, but Dylan was determined. We reached a compromise that satisfied no one but seemed like the only viable option. Dylan would return to the meadow edge to search for his phone, while Trevor and I continued to the house in safety. We would keep trying to call the phone until Dylan could hear it ringing, then guide him to its location by voice. It was a terrible plan, but every alternative seemed worse. Dylan disappeared back into the forest, leaving Trevor and me to complete the final 10 minutes of trail to his house. Those 10 minutes felt like hours, with every shadow potentially concealing threat and every sound potentially signaling danger. When we finally emerged from the trees and saw the lights of Dylan's backyard, the relief was overwhelming. We made it to the pool area and immediately began calling Dylan's phone, listening for the sound of ringing that would help him locate it. After several attempts, the phone was answered, and we heard Dylan's voice reporting that he'd found it. But something in his tone was wrong. Too calm, too controlled, lacking the relief and urgency we expected. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Dylan claiming he was on his way back but needing more time due to some unspecified difficulty with the trail. His responses to our questions were reasonable but somehow felt rehearsed, as if he was following a script rather than having a natural conversation. It was Trevor who first voiced the suspicion we were both feeling. "That's not Dylan," he said after we'd ended the call. "Something's wrong with his voice." I had noticed it too. Subtle differences in inflection and phrasing that suggested we weren't talking to our friend at all. We tried calling back, but now the phone went straight to voicemail. We waited another 20 minutes, then tried again with the same result. Dylan never returned to the house that night. When his parents came home the next morning, we had to explain that he'd gone missing during a hiking trip and that we'd lost contact with him somewhere in the forest. The search and rescue operation lasted 3 days and involved dozens of volunteers, but no trace of Dylan was ever found. The official conclusion was that he'd gotten lost in the extensive forest system and either succumbed to exposure or fallen from one of the many cliff areas in the region. His body was never recovered. Camden was found 2 days later, nearly 10 miles from where we'd last seen him, sitting beside a rural highway with no memory of how he'd gotten there. He remembered starting down the alternate trail, but claimed his next clear memory was waking up beside the road with concerned motorists trying to help him. Medical examination revealed no physical injuries, but he displayed signs of severe psychological trauma and would never discuss what had happened during his missing time. Trevor and I kept our mouths shut about the supernatural elements of that night. Who would have believed us? Instead, we supported the official theory about getting lost and separated in unfamiliar terrain. But we both knew the truth was far stranger and more terrifying than anyone was prepared to accept. I still have nightmares about that night. Dreams where I'm back in those dark woods listening to voices that sound like my friends, but carry undertones of something inhuman. Sometimes I wake up convinced I can hear Dylan calling my name from somewhere outside my bedroom window. The rational part of my mind knows it's just trauma and guilt, but there's always that small part that wonders if something followed us back from the mountain. The trail behind Dylan's old house was closed permanently after 3 more hikers went missing over the following year. The official reason was unstable terrain and dangerous wildlife, but locals whispered about stranger explanations. The house itself sat empty for months before Dylan's family finally sold it to buyers from out of state who had no knowledge of its history. I never went night hiking again. Some experiences change you in fundamental ways, and that night in the Catskill Mountains taught me that there are things in this world that we're not meant to encounter. Sometimes the darkness that surrounds us isn't empty. Sometimes it's full of things that are better left undiscovered. The guilt over Dylan's disappearance will stay with me forever. If we hadn't split up, if we hadn't let him go back for that phone, if we'd been braver or smarter or just made different choices, maybe he'd still be alive. But what if is a dangerous game when you're dealing with forces beyond human understanding. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and some questions are too dangerous to ask. I tell this story not to entertain or frighten, but as a warning. The wilderness holds secrets that have been hidden for good reasons. If you find yourself in the deep woods at night and you start to sense that you're not alone, trust that instinct. If you hear voices calling your name from the darkness, don't assume they belong to friends. And if something seems wrong in ways you can't quite explain, don't ignore that feeling in the name of logic or bravery. Some things should be left alone in the darkness where they belong. Back in 2003, when I was 14, I found solace in the dense woodlands that stretched behind our family's property in the mountains of West Virginia. Our house sat on the edge of civilization, where the suburban sprawl gave way to untamed wilderness that seemed to swallow sound and light with equal hunger. The locals called the looming peaks mountains, though they were more accurately described as ancient hills worn down by millennia of wind and rain. Still, they towered above everything else in our valley, casting long shadows that crept across our yard each evening like grasping fingers. My daily companions were 3 dogs. Rusty, a massive golden retriever St. Bernard mix whose gentle nature belied his intimidating size. Pepper, a beagle whose nose never stopped twitching at invisible scents. And Bandit, the neighbor's scrappy terrier mix who had adopted our pack as his own family. These animals became my escape from the suffocating atmosphere at home, where my father's drinking had transformed our once peaceful household into a battlefield of slammed doors and raised voices. The woods called to me like a siren song. Every morning after breakfast, I would whistle for the dogs and we'd disappear into the green maze for hours. Our usual route took us through a concrete culvert that passed beneath the county road, following Anderson Creek as it wound its way up toward the base of the mountain. The creek sang to us as we walked, a constant burbling melody that drowned out the distant sounds of traffic and human activity. The destination of our daily pilgrimage was a pond nestled in a natural amphitheater at the mountain's base. Surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to scratch at the sky with their needle-sharp branches, the water reflected the canopy above like a dark mirror. The air here tasted different, cleaner somehow, but also heavier, as if it carried the weight of secrets hidden in the mountain's belly. I had discovered an old deer stand constructed from weathered planks and rusted nails, probably abandoned by hunters years before my family moved to the area. The wooden platform sat 15 feet above the ground, offering a commanding view of the pond and the creek that fed it. From this vantage point, I could observe the wildlife that called these woods home. White-tailed deer that moved like ghosts through the underbrush, squirrels that chattered angrily at our intrusion, and rabbits that froze like statues when they sensed our presence. Once, I had watched a black bear emerge from the tree line to drink from the pond's edge. My heart hammered against my ribs as the massive creature lowered its head to the water, muscles rippling beneath its dark fur. The dogs had remained perfectly still, some primal instinct warning them not to challenge this apex predator. After what felt like an eternity, the bear had simply melted back into the forest, leaving only paw prints in the mud as evidence of its visit. The woods became my refuge from the chaos of adolescence. My body was changing in ways that embarrassed and confused me. growth spurts that left me clumsy and self-conscious. At home, I felt trapped between childhood and adulthood, neither fish nor fowl. But here, surrounded by ancient trees and the steady pulse of nature, I could simply exist without judgment or expectation. The property where our pond sat belonged to the old Hartley tobacco farm, though the family had stopped actively farming the land years ago. A dirt track, barely wide enough for a pickup truck, wound between clusters of pine trees and eventually connected to the main road. The nearest houses were scattered like islands in the forest, their lights barely visible through the thick canopy even at night. Sometimes the woods felt ominous, especially when storm clouds gathered overhead and cast the world into premature twilight. The trees would creak and groan in the wind, their branches scraping against each other with sounds that resembled whispered conversations in a language I couldn't understand. But I always convinced myself these feelings were simply products of an overactive imagination, remnants of childhood fears that I was determined to outgrow. The creek that supplied the pond remained a mystery to me. Unlike the clearly defined waterway that carried runoff down the mountain, the source creek seemed to play hide-and-seek, disappearing into underground channels only to bubble up again yards away. I had always been too cautious to follow it very far into the mountain's depths, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated their canopy. But as autumn painted the leaves in shades of fire and gold, my curiosity finally overcame my caution. The days were growing shorter, and soon winter would force me to find indoor diversions. If I was going to solve the mystery of the creek's source, it had to be now. The morning I decided to trace the creek to its source dawned gray and overcast, with low-hanging clouds that seemed to press down on the world like a heavy blanket. The air carried the sharp scent of decomposing leaves and the promise of rain. As I called for the dogs, a strange restlessness had settled in my bones. A feeling I couldn't quite name, but that made me eager to lose myself in the woods. We followed our usual path through the culvert and along the creek, but instead of stopping at the pond, I led my four-legged companions past our normal playground and deeper into the mountain's embrace. The trees here grew differently than in the lower elevations. Taller, straighter, with trunks so thick that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. Their bark was dark with moisture, and thick moss carpeted their roots like green velvet. The creek itself seemed wilder here, tumbling over rocks and fallen logs with more urgency than the gentle babbling I was accustomed to. Every few hundred yards the water would vanish into the earth, swallowed by some invisible mouth in the mountain's bedrock. Then, just when I thought I had lost the trail entirely, I would spot it emerging from beneath a boulder or bubbling up from a depression in the forest floor. The dogs seemed unusually alert as we climbed higher, their ears pricked forward and their noses working overtime to process the complex cocktail of scents that grew stronger with each step. Rusty, normally the most laid back of the 3, kept glancing back at me with what I could only describe as concern in his warm brown eyes. Pepper had abandoned his usual habit of investigating every interesting smell, instead staying close to my side with his tail held low. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water. In all my time in these woods, I had never experienced such complete absence of sound. No bird calls echoed through the trees, no rustling betrayed the presence of small mammals scurrying through the underbrush. Even the insects seemed to have vanished, leaving only the sound of our footsteps and the creek's journey toward the valley below. After what felt like hours of climbing, though it was probably only 30 minutes, the creek took a sharp turn around a cluster of moss-covered boulders. The water disappeared once again, but this time I could see where it re-emerged, a thin trickle seeping from beneath an overhanging ledge about 50 yards ahead. My heart quickened with the excitement of discovery. Finally, I would solve the mystery that had puzzled me for months. But as I approached the spring's source, the atmosphere in the woods shifted in a way that made my skin crawl. The air grew thick and heavy, as if a storm was building, though the overcast sky showed no signs of breaking. More disturbing was the smell that began to assault my nostrils, a stench so foul and overwhelming that I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. It wasn't the clean decay of fallen leaves, or even the sharp ammonia scent of animal waste. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to bypass my nose and attack my brain directly with its wrongness. The odor carried notes of rotting meat, but underneath lay something else, something chemical and artificial that had no place in this natural setting. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. Every muscle tensed, every nerve fired warning signals that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. The hair on my arms stood up as if charged with electricity, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the cool mountain air. The dogs felt it too. All three animals had frozen in place, their bodies rigid with alert attention. Rusty's massive head swiveled slowly from side to side, scanning the forest for threats I couldn't see. Pepper had begun to whine, a high-pitched keen that seemed to vibrate in harmony with the wrongness permeating the air around us. And then, from somewhere beyond the rocky outcropping where the spring emerged, came a sound that transformed my unease into raw terror. It started as a low rumble, so deep I felt it more than heard it, vibrating through the soles of my feet and up into my chest cavity. The sound had no animal equivalent I could identify. Too large for a dog's growl, too sustained for a bear's warning call, too primal for anything that belonged in a civilized world. The rumble built in intensity, and beneath it I began to detect something that made my knees weak. Intelligence. This wasn't the random noise of wind through trees or water flowing over rocks. Something was producing this sound deliberately, something that was aware of our presence and was responding to our intrusion into its domain. The rumbling ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt solid. In that moment of absolute quiet, I became hyper-aware of my own mortality. My heart thundered against my ribs with such force I was certain whatever lurked beyond those rocks could hear it. Each breath seemed unnaturally loud, each small movement of my clothing amplified to the point of embarrassment. Then Bandit, the smallest and usually the bravest of my canine companions, did something I had never seen him do before. He tucked his tail so far between his legs it nearly touched his belly, and a sound escaped his throat that wasn't quite a whimper and wasn't quite a growl. It was the sound of an animal confronting something so far outside his understanding that his normal behavioral responses had simply shut down. That's when I saw the tracks. Pressed deep into the soft mud beside the spring were impressions unlike anything I had ever encountered. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but far too large, each one easily twice the length of my own foot. The depth of the impression suggested whatever had made them carried enormous weight, and the spacing between them indicated a stride length that would have been impossible for any human. But it was the details that made my stomach lurch with primal fear. 5 toe marks, each ending in what appeared to be a claw or nail that had gouged additional furrows in the earth. The ball of the foot had pressed so deep into the ground that water was already beginning to seep into the depression. These weren't old tracks. They were fresh, possibly made within the last few hours. The stench grew stronger as I stared at the evidence of something's presence, and I realized with growing horror that the smell wasn't coming from carrion or waste. It was coming from the creature itself, a living musk so potent and alien that my body recognized it as belonging to a predator, something that viewed me not as a fellow inhabitant of the forest, but as potential prey. Rusty made the decision for all of us. Without warning, he barreled into me from behind with enough force to knock me backward several steps, his massive frame positioning itself between me and the source of those tracks. His hackles had risen to form a ridge of bristling fur along his spine, and his lips were pulled back to reveal teeth that suddenly looked far more formidable than I had ever noticed. Pepper and Bandit flanked me immediately, their own defensive postures transforming my gentle companions into a pack of guard animals I barely recognized. All 3 dogs began to back away from the spring, their eyes never leaving the shadows beyond the rocky overhang. They moved with a coordination that spoke of instincts far older than their domestication, behaviors programmed into their DNA by millions of years of evolution. The message was clear. We were in the presence of an apex predator, and our only chance of survival was immediate retreat. I didn't need to be told twice. Fighting every instinct that urged me to run screaming down the mountain, I began to back away slowly, keeping my movements smooth and deliberate. I had read enough about predatory animals to know that sudden movements could trigger a chase response, and something deep in my lizard brain warned me that if this thing decided to pursue us, no amount of running would save us. The woods around us had taken on a menacing quality that I had never noticed before. Every shadow seemed to conceal watching eyes. Every rustle of wind through the leaves sounded like footsteps. The trees themselves appeared to lean inward, their branches reaching toward us like gnarled fingers eager to snare the unwary. We had retreated perhaps 100 yards when I heard it again, that rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath our feet. This time, however, it was closer, much closer, and it was moving. The sound of something large crashing through the underbrush reached us, branches snapping and leaves rustling with the passage of a body that clearly had no interest in moving quietly. Whatever was pursuing us had abandoned stealth in favor of intimidation, and the psychological effect was devastating. My careful retreat collapsed into a barely controlled stumble as the dogs began to panic in earnest. Rusty pushed against my legs, nearly knocking me off balance in his eagerness to put distance between us and whatever was coming. Pepper had begun to bark, sharp yips of terror that echoed off the mountain slopes and came back to us distorted and strange. The crashing sounds were getting closer, and now I could hear something else that made my blood freeze in my veins. Breathing. Deep, rhythmic inhalations and exhalations that spoke of something far larger than any animal I had ever encountered. The breathing had an almost mechanical quality, as if it were being produced by some massive bellows rather than living lungs. My retreat became a race for survival as the sounds of pursuit grew closer with each passing second. The dogs had abandoned all pretense of calm, their panic infectious and absolute. Rusty's massive form crashed through the underbrush beside me, his usual grace replaced by desperate urgency. Pepper's barks had risen to an almost hysterical pitch, while Bandit ran in tight circles, unable to decide which direction offered the greatest safety. The breathing behind us had changed, becoming more labored and somehow angry. Whatever was following us was having to work harder to navigate the thick forest, but it showed no signs of giving up the chase. If anything, the sounds of its pursuit were becoming more aggressive, more determined. Through the trees ahead, I caught glimpses of the dirt road that would lead us back to civilization. The sight filled me with desperate hope, but I knew we had at least another quarter-mile to cover, and the terrain between us and safety was some of the most treacherous in the entire forest. Fallen logs created natural barriers that would slow our progress, while shallow creek crossings threatened to trip us up and leave us vulnerable. Behind us, the crashing sounds had taken on a rhythm that suggested our pursuer was no longer simply following our trail, but was actively trying to cut us off. The sounds would grow distant for a few moments, then suddenly seem to come from a completely different direction, as if whatever was chasing us possessed an intimate knowledge of these woods that allowed it to take shortcuts we couldn't even imagine. The stench followed us like a malevolent cloud, growing stronger whenever the sounds of pursuit drew near. It was the smell of something that had never known soap or cleanliness, something that lived in the deep places of the earth where sunlight never penetrated. Mixed with the musk was another odor that I gradually recognized as the smell of old blood. Not fresh kills, but the accumulated scent of countless hunts, countless victories over prey that had been less fortunate than we were proving to be. My lungs burned with the effort of maintaining our pace through the thick forest. Branches whipped across my face and arms, leaving stinging welts that I barely noticed in my desperation to reach safety. My legs felt like jelly, muscles trembling with exhaustion and terror in equal measure. But the alternative to keeping moving was too horrible to contemplate. The dogs began to exhibit behavior I had never seen before. Instead of running ahead as they normally would, they formed a protective formation around me, with Rusty taking point and the two smaller dogs covering our flanks. They moved with a unity of purpose that spoke of instincts awakened by the presence of a predator their ancestors would have recognized and feared. Pepper had stopped barking, reserving his energy for the run, but his silence was somehow more ominous than his previous panic. Bandit's small legs worked frantically to keep pace with his larger companions, his usual playful demeanor replaced by grim determination. These weren't pets anymore. They were pack animals facing a threat to their family, and their loyalty was both touching and terrifying. As we crashed through a particularly thick stand of saplings, I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. Something large and dark was moving through the trees behind us, barely visible between the thick trunks, but unmistakably there. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, flowing between obstacles that should have slowed it down. In that brief glimpse, I caught an impression of enormous height and impossible breadth, as if a shadow had taken physical form and learned to hunt. The sight sent a fresh wave of adrenaline coursing through my system, and I found reserves of speed I didn't know I possessed. The dirt road was close now. I could see patches of packed earth through the trees ahead. But our pursuer seemed to sense our impending escape, and the sounds of its approach took on a new urgency. Branches began to snap with increasing frequency behind us, and the rhythmic breathing grew so loud it seemed to fill the entire forest. Whatever was chasing us was no longer content to follow at a distance. It was closing in for what I could only assume would be the final confrontation. The smell had become overwhelming, a physical presence that made my eyes water and my stomach clench with nausea. It was the smell of something ancient and primal, something that belonged to an earlier age when humans were prey instead of predators. My body's reaction to the odor was beyond conscious control. Every cell screamed warnings that this was wrong, dangerous, utterly antithetical to human survival. The dirt road appeared through the trees like a vision of salvation, its packed earth surface gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight. But our relief was short-lived as the sounds behind us suddenly intensified, as if our pursuer had recognized our destination and was making a final desperate attempt to prevent our escape. The crashing through the underbrush became almost rhythmic, like the drumbeat of some primitive war dance. Whatever was following us was no longer making any attempt at stealth. It was announcing its presence with every step, every broken branch, every displaced stone. The psychological effect was devastating, a constant reminder that we were being hunted by something that felt no need to hide its intentions. As we burst from the tree line onto the road, I felt a moment of pure euphoria. We had made it to open ground, where whatever lurked in the shadows would be exposed and vulnerable. But my celebration was premature. The breathing sounds had not diminished with our emergence from the forest. If anything, they seemed closer than ever. The dogs were in full panic mode now, their earlier coordination dissolved into individual terror. Rusty ran in wide circles, unable to decide which direction offered the greatest safety. Pepper had resumed his frantic barking, but the sounds that emerged from his throat were unlike any noise I had ever heard him make. High-pitched yelps of pure fear that seemed to tear at the very air around us. Bandit had made his choice. The small terrier mix was running flat out toward the main road, his short legs pumping with desperate efficiency. His message was clear. Whatever was pursuing us was something that even the bravest dog wouldn't face. If Bandit was running, we all should be running. I stumbled after him, my legs shaking with exhaustion and terror. The dirt road stretched ahead of us like a lifeline, but it felt impossibly long. Each step seemed to take forever, as if I were running through thick syrup instead of air. Behind us, the sounds from the forest had taken on a new quality. Expectant, patient, as if our pursuer was content to let us exhaust ourselves before making its final move. The stench followed us onto the road, carried by a wind that seemed to blow from the heart of the mountain itself. It was getting stronger rather than weaker, and I realized with growing horror that whatever was producing that smell was keeping pace with us despite our desperate flight. The thought that something so large could move so quickly through dense forest filled me with a despair that threatened to overwhelm my remaining strength. My chest felt like it was on fire, each breath a struggle against lungs that seemed determined to shut down. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth as my body began to rebel against the punishment I was inflicting on it. But the alternative to keeping moving was unthinkable. Whatever was behind us had demonstrated patience and intelligence, qualities that made it far more dangerous than any simple animal. The main road appeared ahead of us like a mirage, its asphalt surface promising the return to civilization and safety. Cars occasionally passed along its length, their occupants blissfully unaware of the drama playing out in the forest just yards from their comfortable vehicles. The sight of those normal, everyday machines filled me with such longing that I nearly wept. But as we approached the road's edge, something changed in the forest behind us. The crashing sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The sudden absence of pursuit was more unsettling than the chase itself had been, suggesting that our tormentor had either given up or had found a better position from which to observe us. The dogs felt it too. One by one, they slowed their desperate flight and turned to face the tree line we had just escaped. Their hackles remained raised, their bodies tense with readiness to flee again if necessary. But something in their posture suggested that the immediate danger had passed, that whatever had been hunting us had chosen to withdraw rather than expose itself to the open ground of the road. I reached the asphalt and collapsed onto its warm surface, my legs finally giving out from exhaustion and relief. The solid feel of human-made civilization beneath my body was the most beautiful sensation I had ever experienced. We had made it. We were safe. But as I lay there gasping for breath, I became aware of something that chilled me to the bone. The stench hadn't diminished with our escape from the forest. If anything, it seemed stronger than ever, as if its source was very close, perhaps even within sight of our position on the road. As I struggled to catch my breath on the warm asphalt, a new horror began to creep into my consciousness. The dogs hadn't relaxed despite our apparent escape. All three animals stood rigid with attention, their eyes fixed on the tree line we had just escaped. Their behavior suggested that whatever had pursued us was still there, still watching, still waiting. The silence that had replaced the sounds of pursuit was somehow more menacing than the chase itself had been. It was the silence of a predator that had achieved its desired position, the quiet of something that no longer needed to move because it had already won some game I didn't understand. The absence of sound pressed against my eardrums like physical weight, making me acutely aware of every small noise, my labored breathing, the dogs panting, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. But it was the smell that truly terrified me. The stench that had driven us from the forest hadn't diminished with distance. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger. The wind carried it across the open space of the dirt road in waves, each gust bringing fresh assaults on my already traumatized senses. It was the smell of something that had no business existing in the modern world, something that belonged to nightmares and ancient fears. As my breathing gradually returned to normal, I became aware of a new sensation that made my skin crawl. I felt watched, not the casual observation of forest animals or the distant attention of passing motorists, but the focused, intense scrutiny of something with intelligence and malevolent intent. The feeling was so strong it was almost physical, like invisible fingers touching the back of my neck. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to keep my eyes fixed on the safety of the road ahead, I turned to look back at the forest. The tree line appeared innocent enough in the gray afternoon light. Just another stand of pine and oak trees bordering a country road. But as my eyes adjusted to the shadows beneath the canopy, I began to make out something that didn't belong. Deep in the darkness between the trees, perhaps 50 yards from where we stood, something large and dark lurked just beyond the reach of clear vision. It wasn't moving, but it was undeniably there, a shadow within shadows that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The longer I stared, the more convinced I became that it was staring back. The dogs had noticed it too. Rusty's massive frame trembled with barely controlled aggression, his instincts torn between the desire to protect his pack and the wisdom that said this was not a fight he could win. Pepper had begun to whine again, a sound so filled with primal fear that it seemed to vibrate in harmony with the wrongness emanating from the forest. Whatever was watching us from the trees had achieved something that no wild animal had ever managed. It had stripped away millions of years of human evolution and reduced me to the level of prey. Every primitive survival instinct buried in my DNA was screaming warnings that this was a predator specifically designed to hunt things like me. The feeling was so overwhelming that I could barely think coherently. The shape in the shadows seemed to shift slightly, and for one terrifying moment, I thought I saw eyes. Not the reflective shine of normal animal vision, but something deeper and more intelligent. Something that recognized me as an individual rather than simply potential food. The gaze that met mine across the distance was calculating, patient, and utterly alien to anything I had ever encountered in nature. My legs began to shake again, not from exhaustion this time, but from the sheer psychological pressure of being studied by something that clearly viewed me as inferior. It was like being examined by a scientist. Except I was the specimen, and the conclusions being drawn about my capabilities and vulnerabilities were not comforting. The wind shifted, carrying another wave of that impossible stench across the open ground. The smell hit me like a physical blow, so intense and nauseating that I had to fight not to vomit right there on the road. But worse than the odor itself was what it represented. Proof that whatever was watching us from the trees was real, physical, and close enough to contaminate the air we were breathing. Time seemed to stretch as we faced each other across the divide between civilization and wilderness. I knew I should run, should put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever lurked in those shadows. But I found myself paralyzed by the intensity of its attention, trapped like a rabbit in headlights by something my brain couldn't properly process. The dogs made the decision for me. As if responding to some signal I couldn't perceive, all three animals suddenly bolted toward the main road. Their panic was so complete and immediate that it broke the spell holding me in place. Without conscious thought, I stumbled after them, my legs still shaky but responding to the urgent need for distance. We reached my house in a state of complete psychological collapse. The dogs immediately sought the safety of familiar territory, huddling together on the front porch, as if the presence of human civilization could somehow protect them from what we had encountered in the forest. Their behavior was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. These animals that had faced down bears and wild boars were reduced to trembling shadows of their former selves. It wasn't until I was safely inside, with the solid walls of my home between me and the forest, that I noticed the physical evidence of our ordeal. My jeans were soaked with blood from what I initially assumed were scratches from the desperate flight through thick underbrush. But as I examined the stains more carefully, a new horror began to dawn on me. The blood wasn't from cuts or scrapes. It was seeping through the fabric from inside my clothes, originating from somewhere on my body that showed no visible wounds. The realization that my own biology was betraying me in response to whatever we had encountered was almost more terrifying than the encounter itself. My body knew something my mind was still struggling to accept. In the bathroom, I discovered that my menstrual cycle had begun weeks ahead of schedule, a development that would have been embarrassing under normal circumstances, but now filled me with a dread I couldn't fully articulate. Some primitive part of my brain was connecting this biological response to the creature in the forest, suggesting implications that my rational mind refused to consider. The smell of my own fear was overwhelming in the small bathroom. A sharp, acidic scent of stress hormones and panic sweat that seemed to fill the entire room. But underneath my own odor, I could still detect traces of that impossible stench from the forest, as if it had somehow attached itself to my clothes and hair during our encounter. Sleep became impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shadows moving between the trees, felt the weight of that malevolent attention studying me across the distance. The memory of being watched by something that clearly viewed me as prey was etched into my consciousness with the permanence of acid on metal. The dogs refused to go outside after dark, huddling together in the living room with their eyes fixed on the windows that faced the forest. Their heightened alert state was infectious, turning every settling sound of the house into a potential threat. Even the familiar creaking of old wood seemed ominous in the aftermath of our encounter. My father noticed the change in our behavior, but attributed it to some minor adventure gone wrong. His attention was focused on his drinking and his own problems, leaving me to process the trauma alone. The isolation made everything worse, turning my memories of the encounter into a private hell that grew more vivid and terrifying with each passing hour. When morning finally came, I felt like I had aged years in a single night. The forest that had been my refuge for so many months now loomed beyond our windows like a green wall of malevolence. The trees that had once welcomed me with their peaceful presence now seemed to lean toward the house with obvious hunger, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers eager to reclaim their escaped prey. The dogs' behavior remained abnormal for weeks afterward. They would approach the edge of the yard closest to the forest, but would venture no closer. Their usual enthusiasm for our woodland adventures had been replaced by a deep wariness that suggested they remembered exactly what had happened and had no intention of repeating the experience. I tried to convince myself that we had simply encountered a bear or some other large predator, that fear and imagination had transformed a normal wildlife encounter into something supernatural. But the explanation felt hollow even to me. No bear had ever produced that level of terror in either the dogs or myself. No natural predator carried that impossible stench or generated that overwhelming sense of wrongness. The worst part was the lingering feeling of being marked somehow, as if our encounter had established some sort of connection between myself and whatever lurked in those woods. I found myself checking the tree line obsessively, searching for any sign of movement or watching eyes. The paranoia was exhausting, but I couldn't shake the conviction that something was still paying attention to me. Weeks passed before I could bring myself to venture anywhere near the forest again, and when I finally did, it was only to retrieve a ball that had rolled too close to the tree line during a backyard game. The dog's reaction was immediate and violent. All three animals began barking and howling with such intensity that neighbors came outside to see what was wrong. That winter, my father and stepmother separated, and our family life disintegrated into a series of custody arrangements and divided loyalties. The chaos of divorce proceedings forced us to move away from the mountain house, severing my connection to the woods that had been both sanctuary and nightmare. Part of me was relieved to put distance between myself and whatever still watched from those shadows, but another part felt like I was abandoning unfinished business. Years passed. I finished high school, went to college, started a career, and built an adult life far from the mountains of West Virginia. But the memory of that autumn day never faded. If anything, it grew stronger with time, taking on the crystalline clarity that trauma sometimes achieves in memory. Every detail remained vivid: the stench, the breathing sounds, the weight of malevolent attention across the distance. It wasn't until I was in my 20s, watching a nature documentary about undiscovered species and unexplained phenomena, that I began to find a framework for understanding what had happened to me. The program featured interviews with biologists and anthropologists, discussing reports of large, undiscovered primates in remote areas of North America. The descriptions from witnesses matched my own experience with terrifying accuracy. The documentary mentioned how such creatures seemed particularly drawn to women during certain biological cycles, how they demonstrated intelligence and territorial behavior that went beyond normal animal responses. Most disturbing of all, it described how these entities appeared to mark their territory through scent and would sometimes track specific individuals across considerable distances. The implications of this information sent me into a spiral of research that consumed months of my free time. I read every scientific paper, every eyewitness account, every theory about what might exist in the deep wilderness of North America. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that what we had encountered was something that science hadn't yet acknowledged, but that had been sharing our world for far longer than we liked to admit. I never returned to those woods, though I sometimes drove past them during visits to my father's new home. The forest looked the same from the safety of a moving car, just trees and shadows and the normal landscape of rural America. But I could never bring myself to stop, never felt brave enough to walk those paths again. The dogs never fully recovered from that day. Rusty developed an anxiety disorder that made him panic at unexpected sounds. Pepper became aggressive toward strangers in a way that was completely out of character. Bandit simply aged rapidly, as if the stress of that encounter had accelerated his biological clock. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the wind is still and the world seems to hold its breath, I catch traces of that smell on the air. It's probably just imagination, probably just my traumatized memory playing tricks on me. But deep down, in the part of my brain that still remembers what it feels like to be prey, I know better. Whatever is out there is still out there. It's still watching, still waiting, still marking its territory with the scent of ancient hunger. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I carry the knowledge that it remembers me too. That on a gray autumn day when I was 14 years old, I became part of its world in a way that no amount of distance or time can ever completely erase. The mountains keep their secrets well, but sometimes those secrets keep us too. And on nights when the darkness presses close and the familiar world seems thin, I remember the weight of eyes that saw me not as a person, but as something to be studied, tracked, and perhaps eventually claimed. The truth is that we share this world with things we don't understand, things that watch us from the spaces between what we call civilization. And once you've felt their attention, once you've smelled their ancient musk and heard their breathing in the darkness, you carry that knowledge forever, a burden and a warning that some boundaries should never be crossed. I tell this story not to frighten, but to remember. Because in a world that grows smaller and more mapped every day, it's important to acknowledge that there are still mysteries in the shadows, still things that science hasn't cataloged and civilization hasn't tamed. And sometimes, on autumn days when the light falls just right through the trees, those mysteries notice us back.